can't hear anything.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yay!
Yay! I've been hitting like 15 buttons, so I apologize. I am going to apologize again and just say we do have a few people here from our governance committee. Pastor Green and Diane Schussel are on the call already. I see Jenny here as well. Pastor Green, are you able to maybe share a few words and introduce Clutch as we get started? Or is it too loud where you are? All right. Diane, are you able to share a few words? I know you're on the call. I saw you.
Let's see.
Thank you, Diane.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Sure. So I think that we're here today. Everyone hopefully has had an opportunity to read the strategy memo, and we're really here to introduce Clutch and have them answer any questions or respond to any concerns that anyone has about the memo or any suggestions. So Clutch is an organization that has done some work in Houston. I think everybody sort of knows the background. Chicago and some other places helping COCs figure out how to have more effective governance structures for their continuums. So with that, I think I would just turn it over to them.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining. It's really exciting to be on the webinar with you, sharing the governance strategy memo and digging in a little bit to some of the system thinking theory that is behind the strategy memo itself. So the way the webinar will be structured is we will walk through a presentation of the governance strategy memo, and then at the end take time for questions. So as Rachel indicated in the chat, you can at any time go ahead and log your question as you go, and Rachel will keep track of those and we'll make sure we answer them during the question and answer period of the webinar. But you can also at that time just hold your questions, and then you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask those questions, and we can participate in a bit of a dialogue. I want to make sure everyone knows that this is simply the first of many conversations that we plan to have with you in a variety of ways in your community. So this isn't your only opportunity to participate, and we want to give you plenty of time to reflect and process all of these ideas and recommendations. But we also want to make sure we keep moving forward and really digging in together as a community. So we hope that this is an effective first step at making sure everyone feels connected and heard throughout this process, but just know that there's many more to come. So I want to start off by introducing myself. My name is Mandy Chapman-Semple. I am a managing partner at Clutch Consulting based in Houston. My background is really in big system transformation, particularly with homeless systems. So I've had the pleasure of sitting behind many different curtains and wearing many different hats. So I have a real understanding of what it means to be a homeless service provider. I ran emergency shelter, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing. I've done all of those activities. I've also been a nonprofit executive, understand the funding complexities. I also have sat inside government. So I've been the mayor's special assistant for homeless initiatives and really understand the political pressures around this issue, and have even worked in philanthropy and understand what it means to want to strategically invest in moving the needle on these big social issues. And so all of that background is really what's coalescing to bring you these recommendations along with real practical experience in driving this type of system transformation. I want to kind of kick us off by first describing how exciting it is to be in Indianapolis. And when we first started this activity, reviewing your strategic plan, your most recent blueprint, and also looking historically back at your work as a continuum of care, and I have to comment on what an exceptional strategic plan you have. And this has created such an incredible foundation to think about governance from. And I'm really thrilled, and you should be really proud of the work that you all have done together. And I think the work that we can now do together will really help move your community in the right direction. If everyone could just make sure they're muted, that would be great. So let's kick this off here. So the primary goal of the strategy memo itself is really to propose the structural changes that can result in altered behaviors and substantially reduce the frustration, how empower more voices and actors, and really enhance the transparency and communication. As we were reviewing all of the documents from the strategic planning process and from various committee meetings related to the governance work and the strategic planning work, it was very evident that there is certainly frustration and a real desire for enhanced transparency and communication, and for everyone's voice to be fully maximized and for everyone's actions to be kind of fully embraced. And so the structure that we're proposing is a way forward that will help respond to all of those desires. The other important thing to note is that we are not just recommending a governance structure to make decisions. We're recommending a governance structure that really is about action. And we want to drive action across all sectors of the system. We want to accelerate results, and we want to give each of you a way to be more generative in your work together. And so that's really the basis for what brought us to the strategy memo that you see today. So I always want to present the strategic recommendations with a little bit of theory behind it, because I really think it helps ground the recommendations in something a bit more concrete. So, I keep talking about building a system, and so it always makes sense to start by defining a system. In its simplest form, really, a system is a set of things that are interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. And so if we take a step back a bit from social systems and we just think more generically about how systems work that exist all around us, so for example, how the temperature is controlled in the room that you're sitting in, you'll realize that all of these systems run on feedback loops. And so there's various components in your system. So there's a thermostat, there's a furnace itself, and there's infrastructure to move the air from the furnace into your room. All of these things, though, need feedback loops in order to be kind of perfectly calibrated at any given time to meet the desire that you have for your temperature. So if you don't necessarily have a thermostat, it really makes it difficult for your system to work effectively. But likewise, if you have a thermostat, but you have no way for that thermostat to communicate with the rest of the system, that's equally as problematic. So when we think about systems, we need to think both about having all of the right components, but also making sure that all of those components are interacting in exactly the right ways to meet the needs at any given time. And those feedback loops really should be designed not to be static, meaning that they should be nimble enough to be reactive to the desire. So not just set the temperature and then the system can never be adjusted again, but the thermostat can constantly take the temperature and continue to adjust the way the system functions in order for the perfect temperature to be created. So when we start applying some of these system design rules to our own social systems, I think there are some really exciting rules that come into play. So first, we should understand that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets, meaning the results that we achieve today are largely as a result of how the system functions. And the exciting thing in all of that is it means that we can continue to design our systems or redesign our systems until we can perfectly calibrate to exactly what we desire. So some of the rules around that calibration really are first and foremost about the idea of changing the elements or the components of a system has some impact, but usually doesn't have nearly as dramatic effect as really changing the interconnection. And so while it's always easy to say we need more supportive housing or we need more affordable housing in order to make the homeless system move, that's absolutely true. And that is work that needs to be done and a component that needs to be added. We also can begin to change the interconnections or the way these systems interact, and now while we're also introducing those new components. And so the governance structure that we're proposing is really predicated on many of these ideas. So let's dig into the first recommendation. So recommendation number one is really to add a blueprint to your blueprint. And what we're really meaning by this is that you have done an incredible job of really articulating a shared vision of your collective impact approach. You've defined that aspirational end goal. But what we don't necessarily see in the blueprint today is a really concrete drawing that defines how the collective will actually function together in order to achieve that goal. So the first drawing, it really is about what are the system's components and how do those components interact to achieve the end goal. And when we can create that drawing, we then have the ability to organize and define the role of each partner in the system. So let me show you a few examples to make this a bit more concrete. So this is Houston's very simple drawing of how their system works. What you kind of see at the top is all of the entry points into homelessness, all of those entry points feeding into the coordinated access system, particular things happening, triage, assessment, assignment, and accountability, and individuals moving into those next spaces, into those back doors, or those interventions that are going to resolve their homelessness. In the case of Chicago, it's a pretty similar diagram, much prettier, I would say, but the premise is that people experience homeless move through a system in a particular way. In the case of Atlanta, something very similar. People experience homeless, they're going to enter the system here. This is what's going to happen inside our system, and this is how we're going to effectively move people through. What is really neat is that these system components all of a sudden now then reveal very particular system roles that can be played by the different providers in the community. So this is the real value of a simple system drawing, is that it helps each and every partner understand exactly the role that they're going to be playing and how that role is critical to the whole of the system and to achieving the impact. So what the system diagram also helps us understand is that each and every partner who's playing one of these system roles is absolutely critical to our system. No matter how big that role is or how small that role is in terms of the size, it's critical because these are the roles that need to be played. So recommendation number one is to help Indianapolis really produce this kind of system diagram and help all of you as providers begin to really understand and articulate exactly the role that you play in the system and how that role is valuable to producing the collective goal everyone is desiring. So as we then move past this understanding of how, what is the role and how do we function, we then have to start thinking about how do we organize all of you as people and as leaders and as implementers to build and operate the system that you've now designed. And there's an underlying theory here that I think is really important. And we often call this the reinforcing engine of success. And what this reinforcing engine reveals is that the quality of relationships enhances the quality of thinking, which enhances the quality of action and enhances the quality of results. And that can be a continuous engine for success. Oftentimes, communities end up coming together and working together to think really critically about a lot of ideas, but they rarely sometimes get to action, which means they rarely get to results. And you then break down this engine of success, and you're no longer kind of feeding the cycle that's necessary in order to continue to enhance your thinking and enhance your action and enhance your results. So the overall structure that we're recommending is really predicated on this idea that we need to help all of you come together, and not just come together in a committee, and not just come together to talk or to think, but to come together to act and to constantly experiment in order to drive action, which drives results, which enhances relationships, which will enhance thinking. And we need to create a structure that is forgiving enough to allow for experimentation and a reinforcement and a use of this engine of success. The other kind of underlying theory for how you're going to achieve collective impact comes from this creative tension model. So whenever we create a vision, and you guys have created an incredible vision with your blueprint, there is a gap, though, that exists between the current reality and that vision. And any gap always gives way to a kind of structural tension. And I think that's exactly what is bringing us to this webinar today, is that structural tension in your community revealed a need to find a way forward that was going to create a governance structure that was really successful for implementation of your new blueprint. And so oftentimes what happens is when that structural tension is in play, there's two different ways in which we can react to that structural tension. Sometimes we can react with by bringing stressful tension into the mix. And oftentimes what that stressful tension gives way to is a focus on what you don't want. And then it really puts you into a problem-solving orientation or into a reactive orientation where you're constantly reacting to what you don't want and solving to avoid the things you don't want. The opposite of that is this sense of creative tension. And creative tension allows you to really focus on what you want, and it puts you into a creative or a generative orientation. And so as you approach that structural tension, you start saying not what you don't want, but instead, what do we want? And so I feel like the process that we're in right now is an example of that generative orientation, where we're all coming together to really articulate, what do we want? And we as Clutch Consulting are putting in front of you some ideas about what we think is going to be best for you as a community. And as we work together to really tweak and refine exactly how to make those ideas or those recommendations, turn those things into exactly what you want for your community. So recommendation number 2, really building off of those theories, asks or suggests that Indianapolis should really amend their governing philosophy to embrace that engine of success and to put in place a structure that can generate and sustain shared accountability and collective action. So that ability to continuously come together, to think together, to act together, and to reflect on those results over and over and over again until you develop the system that perfectly meets your needs at any given moment. And so it really, that core engine of success coupled with that generative orientation is this incredibly powerful way forward. So embracing that as a governing philosophy, and this idea that all partners can be engaged throughout this process in a tiered way, and through the various levels of engagement, you can use that engine of success to continue to drive people forward. It also gives way to this beautiful shared accountability where everyone is kind of in it together, and everyone's in it together, and they're really focused on finding a way forward. And you know, failing or an experiment that didn't necessarily produce the result we are looking for, it isn't about finger pointing, it isn't about dire consequences, but instead it's about learning together, revealing that, you know, we need to come back and enhance our thinking and then continue to act and move forward to produce the results we're looking for. So what that really looks like in our experience is that it's 3 different kind of major tiers within your governance structure. So the first is a series of implementation work groups. We really are calling these work groups because they function a bit distinctly from the way traditional committees in a governance structure function. Work groups are all about action. So they're all about thinking and acting and experimenting in order to contribute to the creation of a new set of rules about the way we want to do business. And so those implementation work groups have to be nimble. They're about coming together when there is work to be done. they're about engaging various stakeholders in various ways. They are not necessarily committees with representative voices where the entirety of a policy is conceived and created. Instead, they're a series of work groups that interact with each other and produce the ultimate result through the collective activities themselves. And that all sounds very theoretical, and we'll get into a bit more of that through some diagrams here in just a minute. So what is the critical next here is having a dedicated management team who's responsible for helping drive all of those work groups. And when I mean drive those work groups, I mean project manage, drive the action forward, not make all of the decisions, but really function as the backbone, as the skeletal system and the central nervous systems for how that information is conveyed across those work groups, for how those work groups are able to do their work together most efficiently and translate that work back into the rest of the infrastructure itself so that it can all contribute and build to itself. So an active management team is necessary so that this happens in real time and on a daily basis, rather than waiting for a committee to report to a board. We want all of these things to take place in real time. The third tier is a strong governing board. And the purpose of this board is not necessarily to create the policy itself, but the purpose of this board is to have a series of system level power brokers that sit in that space. And when they sit in that space, they're able to receive the information from the implementation work groups as a policy recommendation. They codify that policy. And then those system level power brokers, you're talking about funders in particular, they then align their resources and activities in accordance with that new policy recommendation so that the system can go to scale. So how that really plays out is that these implementation work groups is where policy is being conceived and it's being experimented and tested. And so many people are already well into implementation long before the management team brings those policies up to the governing board. And that's really a big shift in the way things happen today. It's not about conceiving the policy, implementing the policy, and then passing the policy and then going and implementing it. Instead, it allows you as a system to experiment and implement and then really codify what you know is going to work. And the reason why this is really important is because we all have sat in committees and had fantastic ideas and did all sorts of planning and passed a policy. And then as we went to implement, only found out that we weren't quite right. It's that the best plan didn't necessarily play out in implementation the way we thought it would. And so what this allows us to do is it allows us to test lots of different ideas. We don't necessarily have to all come to consensus immediately around something. We can experiment even on things that we are leery of whether they'll work or not. We can actually find out if they're going to be the best way forward before we ever make it a standing policy that then we ask the funders to fund around or with the expectation. So it is a really powerful way to do business as a collective, because it allows everyone to participate in exactly the ways that make sense for them. It allows all ideas to be brought to the table. It allows ideas to be experimented with. And it's only when in action or in implementation we're able to determine that these in fact are the right ways of doing business, and then we go ahead and move forward. So what that really means is that the implementation work groups themselves are the most important part of your governance infrastructure. That's where all of the action and the activity takes place. Your management team really sits in the middle to keep all of the gears turning in exactly the right ways, to keep communication moving forward, and to consistently move those policies up to the governing board so that new funding can be brought to bear, or funding can be aligned in accordance with the implementation work that the work groups have conceived. In addition, the management team is able to bring information back from the governing board and immediately activate that information within the implementation work group. So it's a much more nimble way of creating feedback loops so that your system is highly effective. So the slide in front of you is really an example of how you begin to organize as an implementation infrastructure itself. So this is not a recommendation for Indianapolis. This is an example actually from Houston. And so the best way that we've been able to identify how you organize is through this concept of verticals. So for example, there's the coordination of the continuum of care itself is a series of work groups or activities that need to happen. And so as those, the idea is that there's a vertical for each of these series of activities, and there's a project manager, oftentimes two project managers from the management team that sit in those green boxes, and they're responsible for organizing and supporting all of those work groups so that each of those work groups are doing a small part of the work that needs to be done that contributes to the whole. And this is also how you create really transparent communication across all of these work groups, which is really exciting. So as we move into the third recommendation, I think it's very apparent that today you don't necessarily have an organized management team. And so the third recommendation is really about how do you empower a lead agency to serve as the system's backbone to assemble that management team and to drive the collective action. And so in Indianapolis, it's very apparent that CHIP is really well positioned to be your backbone organization. And the reason CHIP is well positioned is because the backbone needs to be a group of dedicated individuals whose full-time job is to function as the management team, is to help support and drive the system forward. And so CHIP is best positioned to do that. Now, CHIP is not the only entity that should function as part of the management team. CHIP would be the most substantial part of the management team, but there is also a need to strategically bring other partners to the table. So, for example, the city itself. Can bring some of those resources to the table. And in addition, there could be some other partners in the community that could lend their support to the process. So particularly in the case of the continuum of care, of the permanent supportive housing pipeline, there are other players and actors that could help lend themselves to the management team. So what you see in front of you is just an example of the dedicated implementation teams of Chicago. This is not the entirety of that team, but I just wanted to put some real faces behind and around the work itself. And as you can see, it's a wide variety of people that are part of the nonprofit All Chicago, which serves as the backbone, but it's also inclusive of others from the city and from Corporation for Supportive Housing and other advocacy agencies or intermediaries that have particular expertise. So for example, Carrie in the bottom left corner, she drives all of their income and employment work, and she is the executive director of an advocacy organization around income and employment. So this is just an example of how CHIP, like All Chicago, can really serve as that backbone, but they would be working in partnership with all of the other experts in your system to bring a full management team to bear. So finally, recommendation number 4 is the beauty of this particular structure is to kind of fully harness the political will and align civic, philanthropic, business, faith, and other government partners around a collective impact. So the reason why this is particularly important is that you need the alignment and support of all of these other activities. And as those other activities need to drive forward, the infrastructure that we're proposing will work in tandem to allow each of those other partners to articulate their own needs and to support the work of the continuum of care itself in a way that is distinct from perhaps the way those relationships are happening at the moment. So finally, the strategy memo that was sent out recently really talks about a recommended transition plan that gets very concrete about how we can engage each of you in various ways and continue to move forward pretty rapidly toward articulating how all of these recommendations will really play out specifically in Indianapolis, and begin to experiment with working in some of these ways. So March 5th and 6th, we'll be back, and we're going to host a community workshop that I hope all of you will be able to attend. But in addition, as you can see, lots of other work groups, workshops with very particular groups that will move each of these recommendations forward, not in isolation, but simply this is where the work will happen so that we can then communicate and organize all of these activities so that the entirety of the community can eventually vote to make modifications to the governing charter that would be a reflection of all of these activities. So I'm not going to go into detail on each of these activities, but I really encourage you to look closely at the strategy memo and really identify how you can be a part of as many of these conversations as possible so that we can move forward. So with that, I want to open it up for questions. And thank you, Rachel, for making sure everyone has access to the community workshop that's coming up. So we hope all of you will participate. So with this, as far as questions go, if you want to unmute yourself, please feel free to ask that question, or you can simply type it into the chat box here and we can go from there.
And if anyone has trouble unmuting themselves, just let me know and I can manually unmute you as well if there's extra computer challenges. Is anybody trying to get on? Again, if you want to send me a message and you're having trouble sending or unmuting yourself, just let me know. I'm also next to my email if you've got my email. So I just want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask questions. Obviously, maybe I'll be here again in a few weeks, but certainly if you have something today, feel free to share and ask a question and let me know if you're having any trouble.
So I want to make sure I put up my email on the slide here as well, so that if any of you have any additional questions that you think of as you're kind of processing all of this, you please feel free to reach out, or you can always reach out through Chip as well. So just to give you a little bit of background too, and I appreciate Diane so much opening up the webinar today. We are, Chip Consulting is working closely, or I'm sorry, Clutch Consulting is working closely with Chip, but we also are working closely with this governance subcommittee or task force that the board has assembled. And so it's been great, having such a wide array of voices in the mix, and we're working really hard, meeting very regularly to make sure that we're being very thoughtful and also finding as many ways as possible to engage with the community in the, but continuing to move folks through in a pretty rapid way. So with that, it looks like there are no questions. We'll give you a couple more minutes, and otherwise I'll let Rachel take it from here.
Thank you, Mandy. I just posted in the chat also the name of our governance work group members. We're all available too if you feel more comfortable speaking with somebody, and they can also direct questions to Mandy as well. I want to thank everybody for their time, and certainly if something comes to mind later, again, don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll let you all go about enjoying the rest of your afternoon, and hopefully we will see you at our community workshop in just a few weeks. Thank you so much. Mandy, it looks like Brian has a question. Do you want to address this now, or would you like to take it offline?
No, I think it would be great to address it now. Thank you, Brian. I think it's a great question. So the truth is that there is not a continuum of care across the country that doesn't have some kind of history. And the reason for that is how continuum of cares have evolved. And so originally continuum of cares were structured simply to produce a collaborative application for a set of continuum of care funding. And so the nature of that is it doesn't necessarily lend itself to a strong collaboration or a collaborative process because it's about competitive funding. And as the HARF Act came into being in 2009, and there was a new codification of what a continuum of care needs to be, the attempt of that has been to move continuum of care beyond just being the existing for the creation of a collaborative application for one particular source of funding, and instead to becoming the umbrella entity for under which all homeless service activities are organized. And so what's difficult with that kind of new expectation is that, you know, the previous kind of competitive nature and the lack of infrastructure that's existed within continuum of cares, it really limits to some extent the ability for communities to successfully move beyond some of those historical things. Now, what I can say is that, you know, history happened, and that there is an opportunity from this day forward to begin really speaking truth about those fears, about those concerns and mistrusts, and also looking forward and using that generative approach to begin building together a better future. And the beauty of this infrastructure is that it in so many ways solves for the things that generated that mistrust previously, and really creates role clarity and defines things for others in a way that will, I think, create more transparency and more clarity going into the future. But I don't want to say that this infrastructure immediately will remedy that mistrust, but it is a way to move forward from that mistrust. And over time, I think that the community working differently together will help to heal from some of those things in the past.
Why?
So I really appreciate that question. Are there any others?
All right, I'm still not seeing any new questions come through, but there's still time if you would like to share something or a question. We'll stay on for maybe another 2 or 3 minutes, but if we don't hear anything, I don't want to keep people all afternoon if we're just all waiting for somebody else to ask a question. But I do want people to definitely ask questions, and thank you, Brian, for sharing. But we'll stay on here for about another 2 minutes or so, and if we don't hear anything, then I'll go ahead and end the webinar. All right, we're going to go ahead and end the webinar. Have a great rest of your afternoon and a great weekend. Thanks, everyone. And don't hesitate to reach out to anybody on the governance work group or with Mandy if you have any questions.